Hi, good evening, everyone. Can you hear me at the back? Yeah? Well, good evening. For the ones that don't know me, my name is Ricardo Ostos. First, I'd like to ask you to turn off your mobiles, just as usual, and I'm going to turn off mine, which I forgot. I'm a unit master at the Architecture Association, Inter 3, together with Nanette Jakovsky, and run an architecture studio down the road called 9 de Ostos. I'd like to start by thanking HOK and Larry Malik personally for supporting Peter Cook afternoon and evening lectures in the past 2 years, which will resume again in spring 2010. I'm very, very pleased to introduce tonight's guest lecturer, Sir Peter Cook. Having studied for Peter Cook a few years ago and having developed a professional and friendly relationship with him, his families and friends, this introduction is indeed a pleasure. For the formal introduction of who and what our tonight's guest is and does, I could run through his impressive career historically. Sir Peter Cook, he studied at the AA in London, where he graduated in 1960. He taught at the AA from 64 until 89. He was one of the founder members of the influential ARCHIGRAM group in 1960s and was co-editor of ARCHIGRAM magazine. ARCHIGRAM founders set themselves the tasks not to revolutionizing architecture, but rather of the way of thinking about it. He later became professor of architecture at the Bartlett School of Architecture down the road at the UCL. In 2002, the Royal Institute of British Architects awarded ARCHIGRAM the Royal Gold Medal for Architecture. In 2004, Peter was shortlisted for the Sterling Prize with Colin Fournier for the Kunsthaus, and in 2007 he received the Knighthood for Service for Architecture in the Queen's Birthday Honours. He is, together with Gavin Roboton, sitting in the front row, with a talented team of experienced young architects currently building in Spain, Italy, and Austria with his studio Crab. You can check online. He has innumerable books, publications, exhibitions, and prizes. This astonished career that spans over 40 years paints a picture of an established and accomplished educator and architect. But silence what is the stuff that makes Peter Cook so special, a key figure in the world's architectural scene. His concept of teaching highlights the essence of this fact, a fact that is not written in history books, but is alive, and one that can definitely sniff it everywhere that Peter goes. He once described it at an interview that teaching is sharing enthusiasm. An enthusiasm that is fundamental for any student and professional. By looking into the cities and buildings with childlike imagination, his vision has transformed the mundane into exotic and the exotic into mundane. From the hyperactive ARCHIGRAM projects, thinking about an architecture that stands beside the capsules, space capsules, computers, and throwaway packs of atomic word, to Crab Studio hands-on design. He has not only new architects, helped architects to emerge, but also a new architecture. It's important to highlight that not the new of corny enthusiasm of pamphleteers and academic jargons, but with a relentless pace of information in popular culture, where changes materialize in wonderful proposals like walking cities, plug-in cities, friendly aliens, elephant houses, and street furniture that you can find on Crab website. The line between fact and fantasy narrows. The law of cause and effect embedded in design flirts with the enthusiasm of the trick, of the drawing, of the lecture, of the building. In the introduction to AA publication from 1982 book, Spirit and Invention, he mentioned, "There are no stock answers whilst the spirit is willing, and whilst we are continually keeping our eyes open, whilst we still enthuse and regard every possibility as opportunity to invent, whilst we perhaps think laterally and the rooftop flies as a bird, the car park becomes a luxury shoe for the wingling toe, or perhaps like a kid with a stick, we fiddle and whittle until the object in our hands become magical." Please join me in welcoming the enthusiastic magician, Sir Peter Cook.
you. It's particularly piquant, I think, that the introduction was made by somebody who was a graduate student at the other place. And I think that now is the moment to just take 2 minutes to talk about this particular chemistry of what I would call the Bloomsbury thing. About 20 years ago, I did the unthinkable, which was to stop teaching at the A and go up the road to cheer up what was then a sort of moribund place that was more interested in second-rate theory than design, and turned it into that unthinkable thing, which was a place that not only challenged the AA, but sometimes often did it better. And now I think the scenery is very intriguing, because I notice that there are at least 3 of the units here run by people who are actually from the dreaded other place, doing what I did when I went there, which is, in order to make that ship take sail, I raided the AA and took the talent from this end of the street to the other. I'm delighted to say that now the wheel is turning. And after all, this is nothing new. If you come from Tokyo, there's a tremendous awareness of one school of architecture to the other. You know, Waseda knows what Tokyo University is doing, and vice versa. If you're in Los Angeles, UCLA and SciArc have a very, very healthy exchange, far more people sitting on each other's juries than you ever get here. And I think we should be resourceful. It doesn't really matter which end of the street you're at, as long as you are aware of both ends of the street. That's my party piece, to say also that things are very exciting up the end of the road, because just the other day, certain Dr. Marcos Cruz, who I think is about to occupy one of the seats here, has been made the new director, and things will certainly cheer up with him at the helm. Anyhow, you've come to hear not local politics, but about some stuff. My son Alex is about to start with, there will be 10 sections of this lecture. Each will have a 1-minute piece of music that will be just running with the material, which I will then review as a sort of talking piece. Take it away, Al. I've often discussed this issue of hard and soft. I think it comes really stemming way, way back to an article that was written maybe 30 years ago by the late James Stirling about the fronts and backs of the typical English house, where the front was very correct and the back let it all hang out. But I think there's this reiterant feeling that I have between the morality of the hard and the looseness of the soft, that we are a nation that finds it difficult to concentrate upon a straight, and although we're supposed to be Puritans, in fact we're silly buggers. We like to melt ideas as soon as they happen. But there is, of course, that attraction of the rational the disciplined, the methodical, which I, perhaps through a defense of my own inabilities in sticking to the rational, I defend the opposite, which is the right to find it tedious and to get off the system as soon as possible. This is a place I have not yet been to, presumably at some point might, which is the walled city of Beijing. I don't really want to go there, because I hate this kind of thing, though systematically it is interesting. The Forbidden City is not for me, though I like the idea of hiding things. But I wonder about Hilbersheimer. I wonder what he was like. He was befriended by a lot of the people like Taut and so on, who I admire, and was certainly not tight-assed. And yet, there's something vicious and grim about this tightness. Even though on one occasion many years ago I grew, that's a Freudian slip, I made a project which was tight and grim, though it had creepy little holes in it. It was meant to anticipate the addition of something more cheerful, something more exuberant. So in a sense that raises immediately the issue of the hard and the soft. The soft, perhaps from time to time, needs the hard in order to then disintegrate it, or to use it like a coat hanger upon which the coat hangs. In this project, which we did at Crab, we made a building that is certainly seen from here, hard, seen against a canal and a rather rough, tough road and a rough, tough building. Later, it turns more soft as the town against it becomes more soft. So there's the ability of a solid piece of architecture, or collective piece of architecture, to contain within itself both the hard and the soft, and the business becomes that of discrimination, or allowing the physiognomy or the organization or the stuff of the thing to progressively go from the hard to the soft. And in a sense, having set the two things as contrasts, in a sense it is also the question of the one melting to the other that becomes fascinating. Gavin made these wonderful creative drawings in the process of the building. And it is, of course, both hard and soft. It is as a piece of graphic dependent upon the wit of the computer and the computer's user to make purely one conditioner turn from hard and soft. That is actually the surface and the line. Whereas, as we know, building is not only surface and line, it is also a question of the subjective, it is also a question of the patina, it is also a question of play of light. The manipulation of hard to soft can be made at a technical level, at an interpretive level in many different ways. There is also, of course, the question of something which is fundamentally hard, which is cloaked with apparent softness. At what point do you realize there's a bloody great tough old rock inside there? Because that which has grown up upon it is seeming to caress it and say, it's all right, you know, we will cloak you. Nonetheless, it is a tough old rock, and I think there's an architectural analogy here, which is to be able to discriminate something which on the surface appears to be in one condition, and to actually realize that in a sense, conceptually or fundamentally, it is another. So I deliberately put the two, you know me, those of you who've heard me many times will know I have this thing about kiosks. I have restricted it this evening to 2 or 3 only, but these are useful. My Swedish friends, one sitting in the front of the audience, will know that this is in Malmo, and it has there's another sort of hardness, which is a sort of matter-of-fact hardness, which we find particularly in Northern Europe, particularly in Sweden, which is, here is a kiosk that sells sausages outside Malmo station. And it does what it does. Indeed, it is a kiosk and there are sausages. Don't ask for anything more. Whereas, of course, we know that in Rome, a softy city, if there ever was one, it is delicious, it is lovely. And the sweets are very sweet. And therein lies a complete culture. The very, very old drawing, probably the oldest that you will see this evening, suggests that amongst the soft can be pieces of hard in that they are architecture as opposed to as found territory. And of course there was the softy thing, the old Gunge drawing, another old drawing where one said it doesn't matter where it comes from, you just stick it all up there and it doesn't matter how it hangs as long as it's there. How soft in the head can you get? And now one of Tim in the office's drawings of a project we did recently which didn't win the competition but was all about the soft phenomenon occupying space, maybe lighting up, maybe not lighting up, coming, going. And in the ultimate, of course, it's there, it's not there. I remember those post-Rainer Banham conversations in the 60s about the Nuremberg rallies and about Las Vegas, that in the daytime it wasn't there. If you flicked the switch, it wasn't there. That is, of course, a hardness and softness which delighted us. Now we have the techniques to make even more it's there, it's not there. Whether as architects we're fully realizing that, I'm not sure. In another way round to softness is this thing that is so limpid that one can make all sorts of propositions about it. I like to claim that this, which sits in Pasadena opposite one of the green houses, is in fact itself a house. And I don't know whether it really is or not. I'm in danger of digressing on one of my favorite hobby horses, which is that you take yourself with you. You use visual and informational phenomena as you will, and in fact, if you want it to be a house, it is a house, and it's very useful that it is for your own work. Whether some boring person then comes up and says, actually it's not, and destroys the whole mythology is another conversation. But there is, therefore, material softness. Is the apparent, the attraction of growies, I think, is that, of course, man can very, very ill control them, and that, in fact, they are idiosyncratic, they are wayward, and that is an aspect of the delight of softness. Or there is this, my favorite photograph from childhood when I was deciding to become an architect, was Asplin's Paradise Restaurant in Stockholm, which I may well have even shown in this room at least 3 times in the last year. No apology, because it is, in a sense, not dependent upon the basic enclosure or the basic figure of the building. It's, in fact, a series of drapes and veils. And the whole business of veiling is another interpretive form of softness. Or the softness which allows each particular strata of the building to express its own milieu, its own kind of person, its group of people. And the softness is that it doesn't really matter how you pile it up. It doesn't matter in a club sandwich whether you put the turkey on the top or the bottom. It matters whether you put it next to the tomato, of course. And therefore, in a project for Oslo, one was interested in the soft edge of Oslo, and Oslo is a marvelous town for soft edge. You get a tent city that suddenly just disintegrates into the fjord. You get transport systems of the usual kind that suddenly disintegrate into a series of boats that bring 20 or 30,000 people into town every morning. And you get a disintegration. Always, of course, the delight of the North Sea syndrome is the delight in the frayed edges of the coast and the way that so many cities disintegrate into the water. And that one can manipulate this as an architect by manipulating the fact that, in a sense, there is no edge. It is a soft edge. The boat is in itself a building, if you wish it to be. The bridge is in itself a piece of seashore, if you wish it to be. And in this case, one even brings the canal into the arcade. The shopping arcade is itself part of the fjord. So there's this manipulation of edges of territory, that if you manipulate it and, so to speak, creatively scribble over it enough, it is very difficult to tell what is hard and what is soft. Or there is a manipulation of a technology that in this case was attempting to deal with a hard, hot climate, and to use both passive and active devices and things that get damp and things that give off steam and give off air and so on, that one is playing with the edge of technology that is sometimes called the soft edge of technology. And I don't know whether Dr. Coletti has arrived yet, but I'm always amused to show this, which when he was up the road doing his master's course, his first ever project was to put soft toys on his head, which he then described as having environmental significance, much to the shock of the jury and delight, I would say. And that this particular proposition could generate 7 years of work ending up in a special issue of AD, which will come out any minute, and a doctorate, is an interesting academic phenomenon in its own right, which I recommend. Here we are in the Crab office with the hardware. Or is it that when you just have the hardware and no people, it's soft, nothing is actually happening? The real hard condition is when the discussion is taking place, when the arguments are life or death to the building. And this is soft in the sense that the hardware is being occupied by these wayward and lovely people. On the other hand, the discussion, the actual intensity is there. Therefore, this is the hard. And I like to end this section on, of course, on a paradox. The hard and soft points of departure are inherently paradoxical. The business of conscious diffusion overlaid with a taste or an intrigue by that which is not full frontally obvious, I think, underscores a lot of my work or inspiration. This is a typical kind of English picture, but it's really not talking about being English. It's talking about the presence of the object or the recognition of the object. In the foreground is growing stuff, manipulated by man to be neat and circumspect. In the middle ground are still pieces of tree and growth which are to a degree ordered, not as ordered as that in the foreground. In the background, who knows? It's spooky stuff. And to my mind, the foreground, the middle ground, and the background need each other. They need each other not only to make a distinction between them, they need each other to set up questions of the validity of the significance of the presence of the object and the possibility of intangible interpretation. If everything is very obvious, my particular distaste of postmodern when it happened was that it was there, it was there, it was there. An entrance was always one of those, a column was always a column, painted yellow was always painted yellow. It left nothing to the imagination, little to the interpretation, I suppose. Here, I'm perhaps most fascinated by the spooky bit, because that's where my imagination can run riot. But the fact that the substance is similar to that in the foreground, though plays it by different rules, is infinitely interesting. Years ago, Christine Hawley and I made a project. She drew it, I modelled it, called The Shadow House. Again, the conversation was very parallel, that half the things you see in the picture are not really there. They are shadows from something that probably has to be there. But you're not necessarily looking fully at the object. You're looking at its implication. in a series of drapes made in the very early stages of the Olympic investigation, when HOK, as in one sport, got it. I made a model where one was investigating, again, drapery, draping layer in front of layer in front of layer in front of layer. So, of course, there's a link between this conversation and the previous one. I was talking about layers then. I'm talking about layers now. So if we re-examine this Dublin room project, we are talking about misting as well as the placement of coming and going conditions. We're talking about clouds. We're anticipating another section which will be called swarming. We're anticipating the possibilities that all is not what it seems. And that phrase I've always enjoyed. I think Gavin was mostly responsible for this project, which was for a concert hall in Estonia. And this special room is where, again, you're not quite sure whether you're looking partly at substance or light. But in another way, we can see misting as not necessarily meaning misted, veiled objects, but or not smoky, misty objects, but things that are there. It's just that you don't reveal all of them. And those of you who heard Mike Webb up the road a few weeks ago with his wonderful Henley project, I think the Henley project of Michael Webb is the definitive discussion of the hidden, of the presence or the suspected presence of that which is hidden. Here, a collection of buildings, and I've forgotten quite where it is. It's sort of foreign somewhere, so I'm not a very good, accurate geographer, but it's definitely foreign, but somewhere in Europe. And it's a series of intriguing objects, none of which you ever completely fully see. If you're very sophisticated, you can probably reconstruct them in your mind, but that is not the point. Perhaps you should never see them all. In fact, perhaps it would be extremely boring if you took the trees away and said, oh, okay, it's a 19th century second-rate bit of goblin castle stuff. But it is not, of course, revealed. This, which I make no apology for showing, probably in this building for the 19th time, and certainly up the road for the 18th time, is my favorite piece of veiling. Again, Grohe is in a controlled situation, this time in the gardens of the castle at Karlsruhe, 19th century. Or, of course, what happens in Kyoto in many instances. This, I think, particularly delightful one, because nothing is anything in particular, but you get a distinct sense of something that might happen at any moment. I believe architecture can do this. A trick of the photograph, a trick of the computer, a trick of the light suggests that something which we'll see again and which now exists half up out of the ground is something that in a misty day might have more apparent portent than if you see it again full frontally. Of course, this is a trick of the machine. Once you play the trick a little closer, you can start playing delightful anticipations of the mist suggesting action. We don't normally connect dynamic with the veiled, but we might. We might, as it's difficult to suggest it in a single drawing, but the notion of this pulling the light into the Birmingham project and then allowing the day to change the condition by an extreme consciousness of the light source. I'm sure has been used, well, I know has been used by the Baroque architects, been used by Gothic architects, been used by many people in the 19th century, and I think we should rediscover it. This is a form of veiling. It's actually anticipating the issue about to come out of Marion Coletti's AD, where the business of veiling is the business almost of making such an intense carpet rug of a building that your eye is encouraged, invited, dare I say, to keep moving around. And while you're still wondering what the fuck you're looking at, we move on to the next stage. At first, when I was putting this lecture together, I just stuck with paths of energy, but I realized that there's a corollary to that, which is the question also of the patch of energy. In a recent project, we looked at the reinterpretation of a long strip of land for Taipei. The jury, which included the dean of this school, did not choose it, but nonetheless, I thought he was going to be here, and I thought it would be amusing to see his embarrassment. But it's a nice trick to play. I'll sit on one of his juries one day. And the question of how you represent energy, of course, has to use certain kinds of tricks. The trick here was to use the metamorphosis between hard and soft, between the hard architecture and the soft, to energize the progression, using therefore the boardwalk as a kind of musical stave, if you like, and then representing different kinds of trajectory, different kinds of speed of trajectory, different kinds of relationship between the path and that which is attached to it, in a sense symbolically. But the old path thing is fascinating. In a funny old Suffolk recently made garden that many architects found themselves in 3 months ago, it isn't anything particular, but still the device of you suddenly coming upon the axis, and in this case, although you can't see it, suddenly the view of a lighthouse out at the edge of the coast. This business of focusing is also to do with the manipulation of energy. Many years ago, when I was still teaching in Frankfurt, I also used the locality to suggest that a simple device used much in the 19th century, which was to set up an avenue of villas, would be a way of energizing the connection between Offenbach and Frankfurt, that one makes a placement, a very physical placement. Again, with Christine Hawley, some years ago, we won a competition, one of the ones that didn't get built, in Austria again, and we connected 4 of our own propositions with 2 pre-existent ones, a church and a burial mound. And our 4 small insertions then not only would have we had this very perhaps banal device of suggesting that a laser beam could be thrown out at night, but also that the actual physicality of the constituent parts. CJ worked on this one, by the way, and that the physicality would be such that pieces of each of the buildings would be mimics, would be markers of these geometric lines. So that it's the old architect's trick of saying this is an energy, a condition of energy. Let us mark it. Let us bang you on the head and remind you that we've noticed it, that we mark it, that we align it, that we geometricize it. Back to the Taipei project, not quite the same game. You can see the left is where the energy starts. There's thousands of people pouring out of the subway station and then moving on to the deck above this park. And you can almost sense the degree of intensity, very obviously by the intensity of the boardwalk. But then the question is, what do you hang on to? If you allow the architecture to metamorphose from near de steel hard on the left to wobbly cuckoo land soft on the right, and try to make the gradations relatively subtle, it might be said that the spectator will say, what the hell kind of architecture are we doing here? On the other hand, the existence of the boardwalk itself to waywardness raises further issues. So it becomes an interesting exercise in play and control. In developments of the Vienna building, which we won exactly a year ago now, most of the people, not so much me, sweating over a great intensity, a whole series of manipulations are made, and they deal with this same issue. Connectivity, way back in, God help us, 1953, there are other conversations that are usually attached to this particular project. But what is interesting for the purposes of this point is that one was beginning, albeit very tentatively, to deal with the issue of the possibility of diagonal connection, that if we grow up with a history of architects that says you work horizontally, you work vertically, you work horizontally again. But no, maybe you don't. Maybe you move diagonally. Maybe there's a point of intensity here, a point of intensity there. It happens like a bird, the fastest way is between 2 points. Or there is symbolic trajectory, openly in Graz, borrowed from my love of certain constructivist propositions. The needle had the most power of any part of the building, though activity-wise it does the least. And in Gavin's project, recently the concert hall, you see the same play of the black tarred building with this frantic trajectory of the deliberate landscape outside it. Or in a Madrid project, the winding of water and green pathways around the villa is actually where the intensity of the project lies. Often, and I suppose this is a very English thing, coming even from this place, when I was a student of Peter Smithson and some of the people of sort of fringe members of Team 10, there was all this conversation that the path was often the generic element, that the route. And I often like to make analogy with the way in which English literature often has its, I think, strengths and perhaps to outsiders' weaknesses. We don't tend to move from polemical point to polemical point. We have wayward paths, the path being much more fascinating than to establish that one person is a villain or the other person the hero. And paths, even in a scheme as frantic as this one for Liverpool, about 4 years ago, there are actually the generic elements are the old streets which used to lie on that site, though you have to believe me. Or in this project for a competition in Argentina, a garden attached to the idea of a shed as an art museum, a yard where working parts start to stray out of the shed, a further sort of park yard where some of them would infiltrate through, and then an old piece of Roberto Burle-Marx's garden tweaked so that even some of these parts would creep into that pre-existent garden. The notion of the path carrying with it the spirit and the substance of the building, even though becoming in the end not enclosure. Or we go back to the moments, not many centuries back, when it was clear that the person who had power, money, influence and land would send out a signal across that land from point to point and would then play with the particularity of the layers of landscape between. The sending of powers and sending of signals is what this is about. Sometimes one can send them frantically over water containing little more than vegetation. At other times, this is the core of the Madrid housing. They can be in a hidden place, but running with great power and determination between surface and surface and surface. They can be a little more than purely dangling stuff on a facade. Or they can be intentional. This is the intention again for that office, that highly facilitated office block, actually, where the franticness of the scribble gives you the intention of the building. And one then compares franticness with franticness. Sorry, with franticness. Or here, the intentionality is to capture the moment of metamorphosis, let us say, between this point and another. I'm very aware of the fact that swarming is quite a fashionable word, and yet I'm fascinated by it nonetheless. This sometimes in a composition, one is aware of deliberately making the arrangement edgy, not at repose, and suggesting, I think there's always been this, and I will come back to that at the end of the lecture, this love affair that certainly the 20th century of architecture had with the idea of movement, the machine, and so on, and even making the physiognomy of parts suggest rotation, moving, sliding, drifting, putting a dynamic where possibly the reality was not able to take it. This is an early sketch for the Soak City, where the parts of building are in fact in a condition where sort of Armageddon scenario, where the floods will come, or there is human swarming. You only have to look at a place like this, a marketplace with the fairly trendy, mostly ladies, swarming, perhaps for bargains, perhaps for company, perhaps for warmth if it's the winter, but they're swarming. And the instinct, though this is an old project concerned with the metamorphosis, you notice that there is movement implicit at every turn. A recent exhibition we did in Korea is taking some panels which were then covered with pictures of our work, but deliberately posing them in such a way that you're expecting them to sort of drift. In fact, there is a movie projected on one to accentuate that. But the composition being deliberately edgy, or here, which was on the cover of Marcos's AD some time ago, the idea of what I call the Comfo Veg Club, do I need to say more, being essentially a place which perhaps would have a degree of edginess to it. Or in this recent drawing called Hidden City, though the drawing is static and there is no suggestion of tram routes or boats sailing, there is, I hope, a sense that it is not in total repose. And there's some sillies and naughties there, just in case you think it's nice and Nordic and comfortable. Or, as part of the Soak City, actually floating elements, actually kites that might float above this surviving place and grow mustard and cress or whatever up in the sky. And the kites animate or are simply talking about lightness, and that despite the rising flood, there's always hope if you could reach the sky. Or I'm not showing all of the scheme this evening, but those of you who know it, the veg house is to do with the creeping, both insidious and benign. I think it's another theme that I might pursue, which is the question of the insidious, that which wishes to move further, that which wishes to change the state, but it hasn't quite happened, but you know it might, or you know that it will. Here is some developmental drawings from the library part of the law faculty in Vienna, which is what is our big job at the moment. And those dots, which actually represent roof lights over the library, were in a state of almost conceptual movement. They were deliberately not too firmly plotted. There was the possibility that they might be naughty and actually sit over the wrong place. The great process of value engineering, which we've been subjected to recently, suggests that then we only have roof lights that actually sit over a very sensible place. So it always gets a little bit more boring. And here are but not too boring places that they're sitting over. And that's part of the building, as we'll see, still remains the same. These individuals who occupy these study rooms and discussion rooms are encouraged, or coerced, dare I say it, to have different temperaments. And only 2 days ago we were making decisions about the colour of them and say, yeah, Otto will go into a green room, and Ernst and Ludmilla will go into a brown room, and grow to love that fact. And as we see it developing, though we have been value engineered almost out of existence, but still the building looks like it will happen just like this, and the people are grinning who've been working on it, that there is a deliberate, not only to do with placement and sun and light and so on, but also, I think, a deliberate sort of gawkiness, in the sense that one wants it to say, come on guys, life isn't that boring. And it's great fun to be in the university. It's even greater fun when you're not in class. And you don't have to have a bar. But, of course, you can see the effect of the day-to-day discussion upon such things. Somebody phones up, or there's a meeting in Vienna, as there's one going on right now, and then somebody comes back saying, firewalls! Position of lift in percentage area of wasted space. Cold bridge. Terrible corner. Or enjoying the corner and animating it. I enjoy the snake slithering. It, of course, starts to relate to this business of the intangible, or the implication of movement, or the implication that the imperfect is much more enjoyable than the perfect. That the profile might slither, that whole pieces of building might imply that the wind will slither. Here is a location, Pinto, close to Madrid, where we did with Salvador Perez Arroyo this master plan, where, of course, we wanted to coerce the breeze, but we wanted to coerce an otherwise rather flat landscape, pile up some mounding, admittedly, and then make the buildings feel as if it was more animate and more windy than it really was. And that the person moving and working within it would enjoy the surprise of the not complete. Very much, I suppose, in a certain romantic tradition, of course. A romantic tradition which links the slithering snake with the spooky retreat. And way back in my own work of the 80s, the idea of the sleek, slithery building, the one where it's so, and that was before Photoshop, it was in the days of airbrush, where one could try to make it so sleek, like the smooth face of the 18th century Restoration comedy actress. And then, in order to accentuate the beauty of her face, you would apply a beauty spot, an artificial beauty spot, just as these noughties are applied. A direct translation, or in this old project of Paulie and myself, the building slithering around space, and then these sort of ice cream-like library components slithering off it, almost falling off it. Or in the castle at Würzburg, as I have counted 10 striations of controlled vegetation about to slither out of sight. Controllable yet not uncontrollable. And the Vienna building having something of the same instinct. In its earlier, fatter manifestation before the bean counters got hold of it. But still, in essence, there, so that as you, as a student or an observer or somebody coming off the park, move to it, you can move slithering round, slithering round, enjoying. Well, the bean counters, of course, get hold of it, but still you can slither. They can't destroy the slither. Or back to the Pinto project, the notion of whole housing both being a protection and a kind of come on, a kind of tease to the little plots of housing, and this long slither which appears to then and then slither away to the corner. And so we slither and we slither and we slither. The snake slithering. And the metamorphosis of the Birmingham project, it moves from red to purple to blue and then slithers around the corner out. And okay, it's controllable, can be systematized, but it's essential at this point, slithering of it. And pieces of an old scheme that Gavin and I did for the Venice Biennale about 4 years ago, where the pieces themselves slither and droop and drop into this marshy territory. Or inflatables, which are not quite complete and imply that they might bend with the wind and slightly slither, as did the Graz building, slither out of the containment of the older buildings that form the front of it, creating conditions of interstitial space that are to do with the ability of such a building to tease the building behind, but enjoy the crotch at the same time. Gavin, who draws far better than I, slithers his black building down from the old church, slithering and then reasserting itself. In a nearby country, a very unsuccessful competition where they said, we don't want one of those here, we slithered our concert hall around this tall building. We played again the question of teas. And this, you have to remember that Gavin's building is black tar with mysterious lighting, and it slithers down, droops, and drops up again. Back to Pinto, where the whole business is sliding and slithering around the golf course. Why not? It's a funny old throwaway drawing I did once for a catalogue, which says it all. It's just a scribble, but it's all about gliding. Be another title. Gliding would be a good one. Our Babania Theatre, which won the competition about a year and a half ago, but it is Italy, meaning God knows if it would ever happen. But it slithers down from the special containment of the theatre proper, slithering gradually down into the town square. Back, Gavin's black slithering, and then the ground slithering even more. Two of my favourite conditions, or points of departure, the boardwalk and the marsh, are, I suppose, quite contradictory. The boardwalk that makes it possible for almost in any condition, even the edge of Malmo here, to enjoy the two options of either keeping moving or hanging on. It's both chair and street, if you like. Wonderful device. It crops up more and more in one's work, the notion of the boardwalk, or even the fact that it's boarding, this implications, it's soft and friendly, and health and safety make it not slippy, which is a pity in a sense, but it's still soft and friendly, and yet it's determined. Malmo or Sao Paulo, the intention, this is Lima Bobardi's wonderful building, uses a beach, as you see. The boardwalk is the ideal adjunct to the edge of cold water or the edge of tough concrete. And in the Taipei project, the boardwalk here stripped bare of its bachelors, even, so to speak, seen as a system with its own conditions of waywardness, starting to have substance and then being laid upon by the hard, the medium hard, the beginning soft, the very soft, extremely soft, and the mountain beyond. This boardwalk that is the key, but also enjoyable in the way that boardwalks should be, seen from the softer end. And another unsuccessful project for things that go on the boardwalk, whether they sell hot dogs or bathing cabins. Even in the Armageddon, even in the desperateness of the Armageddon scenario, one establishes a boardwalk. There's still enough civilization going on for that, for goodness sake. Or even in miniature, at the base of the Vallecas housing, there is a little local boardwalk for the kiosks to sit upon. Or in this Berlin project, taking the corners of the Breitscheid Platz, which included 2 or 3 rounded corners, one that gets off on the slithering snake, and the boardwalk takes on that mannerism and starts to describe local space as extensions of meandering boards. And in the Pinto boardwalk, the boardwalk is of course inhabited by the little kiosks, which in the remanifestation in the other Madrid project are still there. The kiosks sit under the larger, those slithering buildings, and are a little sort of tease to the systematics of the rest. And here it is labelled boardwalk, implying the tradition and manners of the flaneur, that essential component of the idea of town. The flaneur walks, parades, is there, does trivial things, and the more circumspect buildings look on and rely upon it, just as in good cities the active or supportive building relies upon the dynamic of the street. So here is that tradition still being maintained. But the marsh is that wonderful condition. This is Gavin Rowbottom's birthplace, not exactly that piece of bush there, but somewhere about a kilometre behind. And therefore, working with him on both the East London project and more recently on the Stoke City project, has been discussions that I come from the seaside, he comes from the marshland. We are both into the fact that the edge of the land is hardly there. It is both hard and soft. It disintegrates, and it needs maybe a boardwalk somewhere, but meanwhile the marsh is that very tempting condition, very generic condition, upon which strange things may nearly sit or may nearly melt into the marshland, will be generated more by the tradition of weaving and existing in the marsh than the classical traditions of the city, perhaps. Various weaves from the 4 years ago scheme and weaves from the recent scheme, which is its child, although dependent upon this scenario that eventually that water will rise and rise and rise and rise, and London will go gurgling beneath it. But still, we enjoy. Much earlier, the marsh is preceded by the village, the vegetation. The house is only just a house, disintegrates into a cabbage patch or into a piece of pontooning or into water itself. Slithering and slithering. These themes, of course, starting to join together, reminding us that the possibility of the veg house itself was to encourage such things to happen by way of setting up just discrete armatures. Back into the hidden city, which is a sort of Nordic in origin. It was drawn in Oslo, coloured in London, and sits at the office, and has parts which are architecture, parts which may be architecture, parts which are certainly not architecture, the drift and the possibility of marsh at the very end, declaring itself to be a construct, but having the condition of the marsh, though organised and gridded. Really quite a traditional pair of points of departure. The castle, after all, when I was a child, before knowing that I wanted to be an architect, I used to insist on my parents taking me to silly places in England that were castles, and I collected them like other kids collected bus numbers or train numbers. The castle, to do with prevention and organized entry. So it's not just a question of solidity, it's also a question of power and the play of power. The gate, anticipating that there's something even more terrifying behind it, but certainly the gate, the point of control. So once you have this castle construct, there is a tremendous amount of play in the issue of to what extent you permit entry to the castle. Norwich Castle, a fake-over of a Norman castle, is almost the typical object, the object of ultimate power, the highest point in the town. You don't mess with it. From then, everything is drift. Or you can have Hans Hollein's aircraft carrier moored somewhere in the countryside. I think there were three, for me, for my generation, very important castle objects. Hollein's aircraft carrier in Austria, Ron Heron's walking city components, and of course the Unité d'Habitation by Le Corbusier in Marseille. Castles all, vessels all. They could go in the ship condition. Once you've built the castle, you permit certain punctuations of it in a special way, so that the whole, the naughty nozzle that allows you to see the castle in Graz is a permission. Having captured the incumbents, you let them, you dangle them freedom. Having captured the villa in Madrid, you surround it by a friendly wall, but create of it a castle. Having made the total vessel, this is again the Vallecas housing for Madrid, and having that noisy shaft which I showed earlier, you then give a certain kind of totality to it. The vessel, the total vessel. So as I said right at the beginning, this is a vessel which deliberately allows itself to soften. It doesn't have an outer bailey and a gatehouse. It actually encourages you come in. So it is both at the same time. But I believe that Gavin's Black project is also, before it starts to drift, a castle of a kind. But the castle is very close to the ship. one could apply most of the same definitions. Sailing above the plane. So here, and that which sits under the ship deliberately doesn't connect. Very important that it doesn't. The ship sails with its... Another Spanish project is solid, but it looks as if it might take off like a ship. And I suppose some people have I allude that it is an animal, but some people see it as a blimp, as a ship. Maybe Birmingham too. The tree is another oldie. In the case of the Soak City, the tree is like the bark or the shell of an old tree that sometimes on Hampstead Heath you'll find this evacuated tree. And here, to continue city life of some kind, you cling onto the insides of the tree. Or in Gavin's windmill, which he bought recently, it is both like a tree and like a castle appearing out of the tree. Though in East Anglia, anything is likely to happen. And one likes the notion of the vessel as a tree, or the tree as an organizational generic system. It's an old story, using the tree as the core of the building idea, and then playing with it, and playing with it, and playing with it, and playing with it, and then inhabiting it with apparatus and tricks and survival systems, or dangling it with tempting pieces of building, again over space, again as tree becoming the whole building, or tree playing against built form, the tree climbing insidiously, not threatening, but acting as a sort of continuous antidote to the built form. As you can see, the Cook family is into music, and one is fascinated, and after much concert going, one has been fascinated by, despite one's poor ability to really read scores, one recognizes some of the idiosyncrasies and some of the conditions that we become familiar with, both in observing and analyzing and occasionally trying to design a city. If we take somebody as complex and intriguing as Charles Ives, we see inevitably that there are many strange juxtaposition of condition and intensity and franticness and a few moments of calm. Whereas, I think this is Michael Tippett, it's a more, and it's for strings only, a more circumspect condition that drifts, but still moments of import within, as they are, the city. And in Super Houston, one took the apparent calmness of tree cover and the stave-like quality of the conditioned streets, these computer-controlled streets, the one threading under the other, from which then incident becomes very particular. Or the layering of one piece of orchestration, or one instrumental line upon another, upon another, upon another, and moments at which there is a crescendo, or there is a folding, or there are progressions of counterpoint. And that subplot runs through all the conversations in that book some years ago. Or the creation of moments within even a small town, the deliberate moment and moment and moment that takes the system and accentuates it and then layers it, even in a scheme such as this. In this, the building that you make is but one piece of musical event within something that has to be sensed as a total progression, even if the city isn't very linear. Or, of course, the great favourite of both CJ and myself, William Heath Robinson, the city as a series of incidents, possibly very local. Or in the silly drawing made at the middle stage, the middle stage of the competition process, where we were going from a 30-person, 12-person to a 3-person contest to get our building, suggesting that life is a whole series of trivial incidents and that academies should be no different. Composing is sometimes difficult, and you get into wayward moments. This is the preliminary stage of the Pinto scheme. The Pinto, by this standard, became much more circumspect. The slithering started to take over the raw juxtaposition of different typologies, and the slithering then becomes... It's very difficult, and it's been said many, many times that to create a total symphonic structure, or any analogy of it, any analogy of the process of overlay that history gives you in a single moment, however complex the project is extremely difficult and can rapidly become rather arch. And the components sometimes have to have a certain commonality in order that they can then do very wayward things, or the reverse being true, that if they don't do very wayward things, then one wants them to have less commonality. The city is, after all, made up of the local incident and the need for heroism, coincidentally. That needs that in order to be more than just a silly old thing poking up. And that needs that, other than it just becomes a kind of concrete chantertown, which I think Gunnar Asplund understood tremendously well in this project for I think it was a law courts for Stockholm, where he sensed the idiosyncrasy of the streets and classicized them, keeping the strangeness of them and yet placing an order. You have to be a very, very good architect to manage that. And as you saw, I had that favourite place in Karlsruhe, which is something tucked, would you believe, into such an ordered Germanic system as this. Perhaps that is the point. Only with such kind of dominant vision of order can you have the most extreme moment of romanticism. In my own attempts at making a total town, I still retreated into the juxtaposition of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 very different generic types. You can, of course, have chaos. You can have post-rationalized chaos. You can have romantic chaos. Or you can have the English thing. Yael, my wife, dislikes this city. I love it. And I claim that you have to be English to understand it, that there are no two buildings the same. There doesn't appear to be any order. Even when you have one cathedral, you have to build a second one. Even when you quote from Sweden, you have to quote from your own past. And it is a town, God help us, with 50 medieval churches, which I lived in for part of my youth. And I digress, but once you live in a town that has 50 medieval churches, you get very bored with history. But you still enjoy the fact that you're not quite sure whether you're in a marsh, in a slum, in a place of heroism, and certainly highly inventive architecture. And because it's English, it doesn't really give away very many clues. And one draws from that. And God help us, I suppose this is the Englishman looking at Oslo, which in itself, in a certain light, is more English than the English. But one uses the device of, or the quasi-device, and this is a naughty trick, of observation, quasi-observation. One says, I have noticed this town, I know it, I love it, I enjoy it. Certain things I will choose to notice, certain pieces of my own past I will choose to notice, and then I will compose. But what is intriguing to myself about them is that they are rather inconsistent. Like very interesting symphonic music, which suddenly changes key, suddenly does what you don't expect it to do with the counterpoint, suddenly does something that stretches the wit or the dexterity of the musician. The hamburger against the fish. The hamburger, everybody who knows me well knows I'm a foodie, and I delight in taking food analogies. In fact, the building for Vallecas is a post-rationalized hamburger in that the car parking and the main body of the building are the buns. The filling is that activity on the ground level, and the topping are the sports goings-on the top. And that's it. Top bun, hidden bottom bun, etc. Or Graz can be seen as the hidden filling, one of those stuffed pomegranates or stuffed aubergines or stuffed whatever that have a delicious interior, you know, or those wonderful things where the ice cream is packed into the orange. And the clue of the orange, the clue of the skin of the building, is only a clue. The deliciousness lies within. Or here in the first stage of our competition, we had the idea of the cake of knowledge, which would be the library. And one could almost taste it, because after all, we're in Vienna, until the advisory jury at the middle stage said you can't have the library on the top floor. I can't do an Austrian accent, on account of its, you've got to have the library on the ground floor. The cake suddenly sunk like one of those unsuccessful pieces of cooking. But in fact, we enjoy it. And there we are, enjoying a kiosk and enjoying a bit of the old sausage work in Vienna. And the cake sits within its bakery. Or, of course, this, and we're repeating some stuff, but this is, in a sense, a bit of cooking as well. It's a bit of a sort of goulash. This is a nasty, funny cake wrapping itself, a sort of pie crust that conceals the weird things inside. Or, as we're manipulating the skins and the layers of the Vienna project with cooking and crusting and chipping, and this is all cakey, foodie stuff. The fish, on the other hand, breaks down the sliding slither and makes it scaly, and makes it swim, and makes it so the sliding is made possible by the accumulation of small parts, flaked, drifting, rather like the skin of the flaky skin of a fish, and then sometimes, like a fish, it opens its mouth, my God. Or in the Spanish project, The Office again, it drifts and is made of flaking parts. This is flaking, this is... Or the scales are scales of light. Of course, it got simpler in the final analysis, but it was there in the very early drawings. Scales, the scales become important. Or there's a series of fishes climbing up the tower, climbing up within the tower, draping over it in implicit movement. Or, in this case, the swimming made by the lights, or by the structure, or by the little flaky, reddy parts drifting. The final section. Con, this last title, in a way, there's not too much about. I mean, it's this whole paradox of the love affair with movement, the love affair with the notion of movement, the figuration of movement. But in the case of the old plug-in city, which was done when I was first teaching here all those years ago, God help us, 45 years ago, in a room, not much of it drawn, not distance from this room. It was to do with exchangeability and with its hovercraft components, also to do with movement and craneways and so on. Whether they would be controlled robotically, Dennis Crompton's Computer City, a sort of complementary project, suggested that they would. And that the parts would depend upon their ability to juxtapose and move and exchange and so on. But I think I go back to childhood and adolescence. As a child, for a while, I lived in Felixstowe, and I think this conglomeration still exists. Subconsciously, I was aware of the both silliness of the crazy house, of the something different from the rest of Suffolk about even bad Art Deco, and of course the temptation of the switchback, combined in this fairground and still in my mind's eye. And then later living at Bournemouth, the cliff lift. You pay a penny and you go up, pay a penny and you can go down if you're spendthrift. And the subconscious delight of these things, much better than the 50 medieval churches by this time. And of course it has bewitched, this notion of movement has bewitched architects all over Europe and maybe not a few elsewhere. This is an Italian example by somebody famous whose name I've temporarily forgotten. Nervi, in fact. Nervi wanting to caress and wind round space. Or some funny old, I don't even know where this was, probably Germany in 1928. Lots of things that interest one turn out to be in Germany in 1928. As I said, I'm a bad academic. It's either foreign or Germany in 1928, or sort of English medieval pretending to be not. That'll do. And it's certainly an intriguing object. Whether it actually went fast, whether it was even robotic, it sort of anticipates robots. As this, of course, is entirely to do with being a robotic village that drifts along on a hover pad and opens up. You've seen this thousands of times. And its progeny, canteen in Frankfurt, which remembered about popping out. And we live in these things every day. What is fantastic is that since ARCHIGRAM times, I spend at least probably in a year something like about half a day standing in one of these things that does all that stuff we were talking about. And we even think it's a bore because we want to get on the plane. Or, again, Christine and I made this project in Osaka, where the accumulation of water drifting over the building would suddenly cause an onrush, which would flood and cause itself to vibrate. Just the harnessing of a simple thing like water could make the building, a deliberately dull building, suddenly come alive. And the same thing borrowed for the project on the hillside in Austria years later. And of course, Tatlin's airplane never flew. But it's much more interesting than a 757. It's very efficient, terribly boring. I'm glad it is efficient, by the way. But Tatlin's, which would have never flown, is more intriguing and perhaps more to do with the magic of flight. But technology, thank you, Hazel, technology does not have to wear the cloaks that we expect of it. It can be comfy and English, if that's what you want. Most of you are not English, so you probably don't want it at all. But that doesn't matter. Here it is. It's as robotic as the next. We, about 18 months ago, went in for a silly competition for which they had no money. And it was a footbridge. And I, liking kiosks, said, it'd be great to have a kiosk on the footbridge. Gavin said, it'd be great to make it move. And then I said, it'd be great if it had a bar inside it. You see the way our minds work. And there it is moving. And then we got we haven't got more of that. We had delightful engineer from Happold that made it a really good structure. And the trick was that the kid wanting the chalk ice would still have the kiosk, and it moved very, 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 very slowly. And he could get his chokras, no problem. And Uncle Vladimir would be up after the 7 o'clock or whenever the stairs would come up. Uncle Vladimir's up there having a few sliveritzes. They had no intention of building the bridge, but it is sitting in the front of our back pocket. We would, and there's been a suggestion on somebody's part that we should put it on one of London's bridges. Great idea, can't wait. Could be a whiskey bar. And the robotics, of course, implicit in the way that the skin, the real skin, really, which is not the slithery skin, but the real active skin of Graz operates. And then you move up a piece of moving pavement. It's not even escalator, it's just travelator, it's nonchalant. You stand on it, whoo, it's going up. So much for the crooked finger and the glass of white wine and the Austrian politesse. And you slither up. Well, a lovely moment about a month ago when Michael Webb was in town, came into the Crab office, and he and Gavin and Mark are comparing interpretations, drawn interpretations of the Spitfire aircraft. Boys will be boys is a very important part of the English architectural culture. I'm sorry to be sexist. I'm sure girls will be girls also. But so far, this has dominated much of the best of English architecture. That quirky, inventive, we wish we were flying a kite, we wish we were a human robot, but meanwhile, the Spitfire was rather good, wasn't it? And it was the Wellington bomber that inspired Jesse Reiser and his wife in New York. So that's all right. Thank you.
I'd just like to thank Peter for the fantastic lecture. He will be joining us soon for a lunch lecture series. But if you can't wait for a question and you have a question that you want to make for Peter, maybe we can do one question. Okay, thank you very much.